So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the programming model for Silverlight, especially as it pertains to the phone. And I'm going to compare it a little bit to XNA. Since our previous talk was about XNA on the phone, I want to highlight some of the differences. Maybe you're coming to phone and you've already got some XNA experience, or you've already got Silverlight experience, not necessarily knowing which technology to choose to build your app or game can make things potentially more challenging. And so one of the things I want to highlight here is, why would you choose Silverlight over, say, XNA? Depending on what you're trying to create. If you're trying to create a traditional app with user controls and the ability to manipulate data in a convenient, easy fashion, maybe you're a developer that's used to a more traditional developer experience. So we mentioned last week that XNA kind of takes a step away from what people are used to, and they have this concept of a game loop, and there's not really a lot of events. And Silverlight, of course, is definitely an event-driven model. So you've got buttons and drop-downs, and these fire click events and selected item events, and then you write code against those events to do what you want, much like Windows Forms programming or ASP.NET Web Forms. It's a pretty consistent experience. There's a solid separation between the UI and the code. So you have your XAML, which is your extensible application markup language, and that represents your UI. That's the front. And then you've got C# or VB.NET in the back, and that's your traditional .NET development experience. The tool set, depending on where you're coming to this from, maybe you're more of a designer, maybe you've been doing a lot of work in Flash, or maybe you're used to working with Silverlight prior to Windows Phone. Then you've got Expression Blend. And Expression Blend gives you a much more visual, designer-esque environment to work in. You still have code editors, and you can still write your C# or VB in Blend, but the overall user experience of Blend is geared towards the designer. Whereas Visual Studio, if you're a developer and have been for some time, then you're probably pretty comfortable in Visual Studio. And so while you can edit XAML and do the whole drag and drop thing, you're probably most comfortable as a developer in Visual Studio, even though you can do all your XAML and you can do all your UI there. It just really depends on which tool set you're more comfortable in. And it basically gives you the ability to work in a fashion that you are most efficient. So that's pretty much the why of Silverlight. If you're looking to make games, you can make games in Silverlight, although really XNA is more tailored for games. And of course, if you're looking to make apps, there are people that make some apps in XNA. Typically, if you're making an app that requires high-performance 3D graphics, you need to look at XNA. And of course, with the new Mango tools, you have the ability to actually embed XNA within a Silverlight app, although we don't cover that today. But if you're looking to develop more traditional application experience, maybe it's a data-bound app, or maybe some of the newer types like the Panorama app, which if you are familiar with the hubs concept on Windows Phone, then you'll feel right at home with the Panorama apps. Basically, these are a new way to view controls and data by using a long horizontal canvas. Instead of a vertically scrolling form, you're scrolling more horizontally, and it extends beyond the edges of the screen. And so it's got this wraparound concept, and it's really good for pulling together information from multiple sources. Like maybe you've got some RSS feeds, and if you look at, say, the Games Hub or the Music Hub or some of these hubs on the Windows Phone, you'll get a good idea of what I'm talking about. They're really good for gathering data together and giving you this flowing experience. Last week, 2 weeks ago, somebody also asked me about the Pivot app, which we didn't cover in that webinar, but we'll talk a little bit about here. The Pivot app, these are apps that basically give your users the ability to filter and sort data within your app. And so these are pretty much the opposite of the Panorama control. The Pivot is more of I need to get something done. I need to see this data a certain way. It's very efficient, but it's not the panorama. So a good example of a pivot app would be, say you have a task list app, and so maybe you have a view of all the tasks in your task list, and then you could have separate views for all the tasks that you need to do today versus all the tasks that you need to do tomorrow. And so as you flip from one panel to the next, you're seeing different views of a greater set of data. And so that would be typically how you would use the pivot app. A couple of notes on pivot apps actually. Typically you're going to, from a performance perspective, you're going to want to load stuff up on demand as opposed to front loading everything right off the bat. You're going to, again, use it to display items or data of a similar type, so stuff that makes sense together and that's relatively easy to work with and slice up in ways that make sense for your users. Some of the other application types, or project types rather, of course you have the Windows Phone app, which is pretty much your bare bones starting point. If you want to develop a Silverlight for Windows Phone app and you don't necessarily want to do a panorama control or pivot control, or maybe you've got some ideas about where you want to go, but you just want a clean slate starting point, then you would use the Windows Phone app project type. The data-bound app, that creates a project that uses a list box control and has some basic navigation features to go back and forth within your data and binds to a data source. This particular template actually relies on the MVVM or model view model design pattern. Windows Phone class library app, pretty much exactly what it sounds like. I'm assuming everybody here has seen a class before. I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on that. There's no UI to it. It's strictly a class. So in the previous webinar, we spent a little bit of time talking about the various phone features and how to use them in XNA. And so I want to give equal coverage to doing a lot of the same stuff as applicable within Silverlight on the phone. And so the first one on the list, of course, is the accelerometer. And we've got an image here on the side that I borrowed from the Windows Team blog that I think does a really good job of showing what kind of readings you get from the accelerometer. And so based on how you tilt your phone, you've got X, Y, and Z values that are going to be constantly changing as your phone moves around within a 3D space. Now I do have a demo for the accelerometer. Since we're doing a webinar, obviously you can't really see me waving my phone around as fun and enjoyable as that would be. So we're going to be using the emulator, which means you're not going to get the full range of values that you normally would, but you will at least get a chance to take a look at the code. So with that, let me switch over to the accelerometer demo. And what we have here is a very basic UI. We've got X, Y, and Z values, as I mentioned before. And these are relative to the phone's movement within a three-dimensional space. And the XAML here is not really much to look at. I've got a grid and then the text blocks that actually display the data. The code's a lot more interesting in this case. So when you're working with the accelerometer, one of the things you need to do is you need to add a reference to Microsoft.devices.sensors. By default, that's not going to be a part of your project. So you'll need to go out and add a reference to that, and then you'll want to add the namespace. And then we're doing just a little bit of basic initialization here. We're creating the accelerometer object, and we're setting up a string to hold some values. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up an event that fires whenever the accelerometer returns a reading back to your application. And so what we're doing here is we're creating an event called update display. And that's going to get called whenever we get new data. Now one thing to understand here is that the reading changed event, which is this right here, it does not update your UI directly. Behind the scenes, and this isn't something that you have to do a whole lot of work with, but the reading changed is using begin invoke, which you'll include here, and that calls your update display method. And that's because reading changed events execute on background threads, and a background thread can't touch a XAML element. If it tries, you're going to get an exception, an unauthorized access exception, which is bad. So what you can do, however, is you call dispatcher.beginInvoke to make an asynchronous call back to the application's UI thread. And then that can safely update the UI by modifying the XAML elements, which in this case are our 3 text boxes. So once you get in a reading, it's going to tie back in with the proper thread. It's going to call update display. It's going to pass in the reading values and then dump those into the text box or text boxes. And so if I go ahead and run this, as I said, you won't see much in terms of the emulator because there's no way to move the emulator around in such a way that actually responds with any type of reading. But if you were running this on a phone, and I'll have all of the code available for download from my blog within a couple days of finishing this webinar, all the code and everything that you need to do all of these demos. So if we were to move the phone around, you would see the X and Y values changing as we tilt and pivot the phone, and the Z value would change as well. Unfortunately, not a whole lot going on in the emulator. So we'll go ahead and stop this one, and then jump back in. Let me go ahead and minimize the emulator. So the next feature is gestures, and so Silverlight has controls that any of the Silverlight controls that are supported on Windows Phone are gesture aware, and this means that you can do stuff like tap and pan and flick. You can also handle some simple gestures like tap and double tap and the tap and hold type gestures by using mouse events. So you can either write specific code using the touch class. If you want to implement custom gestures, you can use the touch class, which is found in system.windows.input.touch namespace. Or you can use mouse events for the really basic stuff like tap, double tap, hold. And then some of the controls that you have in Windows Phone for Silverlight actually have built-in support already, and so they will recognize when certain gestures are performed within them and then fire events accordingly. Gestures are a little hard to demonstrate over the web, obviously, so we'll just press on for now, but I will have some code that you can download and take a look at later on. So next up we have push notifications. Push notifications are really cool. They're one of my favorite features of Windows Phone. We actually have a whole separate webinar because we could easily spend an hour just talking about push notifications. So there's a webinar later in the series where we're going to dig into push notifications in more depth. But I want to take at least a few minutes and explain what they are and how you can use them in your apps, even if we don't necessarily go into the implementation of them. So there's 3 types of push notifications. There's tile, there's toast, and raw. A tile notification is a way for your app to push some data down to the start screen of your phone. So if you have a Windows Phone and you look at the start screen, you've got all the little colored boxes, and maybe there's one for Internet Explorer, and there's one for your email, and maybe you've got Angry Birds or some other game on there. And anytime you install an app, you can set a tile on the start screen, even if it's not one there by default. And when you have these tiles, push notifications give you the ability to update the tiles. There's 3 parts to a tile notification. There's the actual text on the tile, there's the image of the tile, and then there is the ability to add an integer, a numeric value to the tile. And so let's say perhaps you have a little weather app that you wrote in Silverlight, and you want to be able to push the current weather for whatever zip code the person who has the phone has registered with your app. And so you could set an increment maybe every 15 minutes, maybe every hour, maybe every 12 hours. You can push a little bit of data down to that tile and change the actual image of the tile maybe from a snow cloud to a sun or to raindrops. You can push down an integer representing the temperature. There's a lot of different uses here, and when you're doing game apps, then there's also a lot of different uses. Maybe you have a turn-based game, or maybe you have a utility app that ties into a game, and it does something like monitoring multiple game sessions that you have. So one of the games that I used to play on the iPhone a lot was Words with Friends, and typically I would have 5 or 6 different games going on with different people, and whenever my opponent would take their turn, I would get a notification that said, oh, hey, it's my turn. I need to go in and play my turn. And if I didn't go in and play my turn, it would also push a number down that basically said how many different games were waiting on me to stop slacking around and get in the game and play. Now, with Mango, so all of this is part of 7.0. With Mango, they've added something really cool. Push notifications give you the ability to do what they call deep linking. So with 7.0, if you get an update sent to your phone and you click on it, then it's going to just fire up the app that caused the update. But with the deep linking, what happens is you're actually sending additional information other than just, hey, you need to go into this app. You can actually send information that says you need to go into this part of the app, or you need to fire up this game or this task, and so it gives you the ability to customize that experience a little better. So in addition to tiles, I mentioned we have Toast and Raw. Toast are the little messages that pop up in about the top 30 pixels of your phone screen, and these are very limited. So you have the ability to send 2 pieces of text, a title and a subtitle, and they're fairly short. If you send anything wider than what can be displayed on the screen, it just gets truncated. But typically it's a good way to send non-critical message, typically a status update, or say maybe you have an app where you can generate reports from your phone, and so your phone app ties to a server which generates the reports and then sends a push notification back to your phone that lets you know when the report is ready to be viewed. And so maybe you could do that as a tile, where you get a little update to your tile that shows a report and a number, which would indicate perhaps the number of reports that you've generated that are ready to be seen. Or you could send the information as a toast, so you just get a little pop-up message, and if I tap that message, it's going to launch my app, which will then, in theory, go out and fetch this report and display it in some fashion, perhaps in a pivot app, so I can slice and dice the information as needed. If I swipe the toast, it just dismisses it. Toasts are considered to be a minor interruption. So the reason this is relevant is if you're inside an app or a game and the phone rings, then that's considered a major interruption, and you will have the opportunity to actually shut down your app gracefully and then go into the phone application. Toast updates are not considered major. They'll pop up on top of your app or your game unless you're running in full screen, and then you can just dismiss them or tap on them or whatever you want. They'll go away on their own after a few seconds. The third type of notification is called a raw notification. And these are cool because this is the ability to send data directly into your app while you're running the app. And so maybe you've got an application that lets you monitor various stocks, and you build out a list of half a dozen different stock ticker symbols that you want to keep an eye on. And when you're running this app, it'll go up to a service that you've created and tell it, okay, I want to look at Goog or MSFT or whatever, and it'll push that information down. And you can, there's a couple of different ways, and this is kind of a contrived example, so I don't know that this is necessarily a best use case for raw, but you could, in theory, have your service push the data down to your phone, say every 15 minutes or every 20 minutes, to update the stock ticker information. Because what's going to happen is that when you receive a raw notification while your app is running, that's going to generate an event, and then you can catch that event and get the data out of it and then consume it in your app. And so there's a few different ways you could do a stock ticker, right? You could make WCF calls and and pull the data down that way, or you can have it actually push the data to your phone. There's a few different options. One cool thing about Toast and RAW is that if you're running your app and a toast comes in, you can actually still consume it as raw data. So you have the option there to get that and then use it in some fashion in your app. Now, as I said, we'll go into notifications in a lot more detail in a later webinar in this series, but that's a basic overview of how they work and how you can use them within your app or within the overall experience, even when you're out of your app, in the case of tiles and toasts. So next up we have what we call tasks and choosers, and these are the way that Silverlight allows you to interact with some of the functionality of your phone. And so we actually have a pretty good list here of things that you can do. There's the address chooser, which allows you to pick an address out of your address book. Camera capture, which will fire up your camera and allow you to take a picture. The email address chooser task allows you to choose an email address out of your address book. Phone number chooser task, same basic idea. Photo chooser task is going to dig into your media collection on your phone and allow you to select an image that's stored on your phone. Save email address, save phone number, save ringtone. So let's go ahead and do a demo of one of these, and we're actually going to do the photo chooser task. So I'll show how that works. So we've got a very basic Windows Phone app here. Not much special in the XAML. I've just taken the default app. I've added a button that's going to fire the code to fire up the chooser. And then I've added an image, which is right here. And that's where we're going to store the image, or display the image, rather, that we return. So if I flip over to the code behind, you can see we've added Microsoft.phone.tasks to our project. We're going to declare a photo chooser task. And then in our constructor for the page, we're going to go ahead and initialize that. And we're going to set up an event handler. So once you go into the photo chooser and you select an image, and then you click the button to use that image, the completed event is going to fire, and then it's going to fire whatever code or whatever method you have assigned to it. So in this case, our photo chooser task completed. So here's our button click event, and literally all this does is just show the chooser. So it fires up this little mini app that allows you to browse through your photos and pick the one you want, and you don't have to code any of that. You just say show it, and then once it is complete, which means it's been closed, then your event is going to fire. Your photo chooser task completed event will fire. And this is where, assuming you clicked OK to use the photo instead of cancel, then it's going to create a bitmap from whatever photo you chose, and then we're just going to take that bitmap and set it to the source property of the image control back in the XAML. So if we go ahead and run this, we'll click the Choose Picture button, and it's going to let us browse through any pictures that are on our phone. And of course, this is the emulator, so you've got a few pictures by default. And I'll go in to some of our sample pictures, and I'll pick this one here. And then it comes back and displays it. Go ahead and close that. Now, typically, when you're using something like this, and you have an app where you want your user to provide an image of some type, you would actually use this in conjunction with the camera capture task. And so what you would do is you would prompt your user to get an image and then fire up the camera capture task, and then you have the ability to, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. You would fire up the photo chooser task, and you can pass in a property that also enables a button so that if they don't want to choose a photo from their collection, it'll display a camera button which they can then click on to launch the camera capture task. And so the end result is your app gets back a bitmap. And your app doesn't really care if the bitmap came from the camera or it came from the photo chooser. It just knows that it's getting back a bitmap, and then it's going to do whatever it needs to do with it, which in this case is just display it on the form. So in addition to tasks and choosers, there's also a concept of launchers. There's a lot of launchers, and these launch various applications and functionality within the phone. So you've got stuff to launch Bing Maps. You can pass in a location. You can generate directions. You can compose an email. There's several launchers that deal with the marketplace, so you have the ability to perhaps pull up one of the hubs in the marketplace, or you can pull up details about a specific app. If you pass in the app ID, you can pull up the review page for a specific app. You can search for specific criteria within the marketplace. You have the ability to launch the media player. You can play music. You can initiate a phone call. Actually, that's a little misleading. You can't initiate the phone call. You can provide all the information you need up to the point where the user initiates the phone call. You prompt the user, do you want to call this person? There's no way to programmatically make a phone call without the user approving it, which is pretty important. Search task, obviously you're going to pass information to search via Bing. SMS compose, so if you want to generate a text message, you can fill in all the properties for that and generate a text message. Just like the phone call, though, there's no way to send it programmatically without user intervention. So you can't covertly send out text messages from your app without your user knowing. And then, of course, the web browser task, which allows you to pass a URL to the browser on the phone and then pull up the page. And so we'll do a demo on some of those. We're going to look at the phone call task, the search task, and the web browser task. So we've got, once again, just a very simple Windows Phone app. And on this one, we actually have all three built into one app. So we've got the web browser, the phone call, and search. And you can see that the buttons just call out to the various methods, button 1, button 2, button 3. Not exactly best practice, but for demos, it's good enough. You can kind of figure out what's going on here pretty easily. So for button 1, that's going to be our web browser task. And so when they click that, we're going to create a web browser task object. We're going to pass in a URL, in this case DevExpress, and then we're going to show the browser. And that's literally all you have to do. For the second one, to create a phone call, you're going to create a phone call task object. You're going to pass it the phone number and a display name of who you're calling, and then show, and it's going to fire up that dialog that displays all that information and then gives you the ability to click a button to actually make the call. And that's really one of the great things about the launchers, is that you can customize some of the experience, but you don't really have to worry about all the plumbing and all the guts of what's going on. You just tell it what you need it to do, and it does it. You don't have to create your own phone class, and you don't have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in order to make a phone call. You just use the launcher, and the same for the web browser. And then for searching, same concept, right? So we create a search task object. We use the search query property. We pass in our search criteria, and then we hit show, and it does the rest. So we go ahead and fire this off. So we've got our three buttons, and for starters, we'll do web browser. So if I click that, wait a second. Okay, I guess I had opened it previously. That's kind of weird. So anyway, so it does fire up the web browser, but because I'd already passed that in, and I guess it got confused. So here we have the DevExpress website, and actually I'm going to go in here and clear these out, just so we can get a nice experience from the beginning. And I'll hit my back button, which will take me back to my main page. Okay, now my emulator is being a little weird. I guess it's the webinar software. Here we go. So if I click web browser, it's going to fire it up. Huh. Okay, I'm a little embarrassed. That worked earlier. Okay, well anyway, so that is how it works. And then if I go back and we do a phone call, you can see it's already passed in the information. It's using the display name up in the top. So it's saying dial Wally at the number provided. And then it gives you the option to call or don't call. And so if you don't call, it just cancels out. And then if you call, it'll use the phone to actually, it'll switch over to the phone part of your phone and actually make the phone call. Now there is no concept of the phone in the emulator, so nothing will actually happen there. We'll go ahead and close that. And then for search, this is going to pass in the criteria to the Bing search app, and then it returns a list of results here. And so it shows the various search results based on the criteria we entered. And then we'll go ahead and close that out. Stop that. Pretty much all the launchers work in a similar fashion. Some are a little more complex than others. When you're dealing with the GPS, it can get pretty complex. These are certainly among the simplest ones. You literally just pass in a little bit of information, fire it up, and off you go. And most of them do work that way. Go ahead and minimize this. So after the launchers, we have isolated storage. And isolated storage on the phone is another one of these pretty cool things that a lot of people don't necessarily think about until they're working with an app. And the reason it's isolated storage is because this is by design. They don't want your app data to run the risk of being corrupted or pilfered by other apps on your phone. And so every application and game that you run on your phone has their own little area of isolated storage that only they can get access to. It does not map to a specific file system location, so there's no way to browse out to it. It's not, C:\/ my secret storage place or anything like that. It's hidden away, and it's tied to your app or game. Now, with isolated storage, there are 3 different ways that you can make use of isolated storage on the phone. You can use the isolated storage settings class, which is in the system.io isolated storage namespace. And when you use that, you actually can store and retrieve key value pairs, kind of like a data dictionary. So you pass in a key and a value, and then you can fetch those back out. And so typically you would use these for storing settings for your app, kind of like an INI file, if you remember those. You can also use it to store simple data, where you don't necessarily need a full-blown database and you don't want to write out individual files. You can use it just to store data that your application consumes without necessarily having to be settings, although that's how it's treated. You also have the concept of an isolated storage file, which allows you to actually create a miniature file system within your isolated storage space. And so you can create files and folders, and you can write to them and read them in, you can delete them, all from the isolated storage file class. And then you also have the concept of a data context. And this is where you actually have relational data that you can access via link to SQL. And so this resides within your isolated storage, and you basically treat it like a database. Now, you do have a finite amount of space. Obviously, you're on a phone, not a giant server farm, but you can treat it just like you would a regular database, just a lot smaller. And I have a demo for the isolated storage as well. So let me flip over to that. So this one here, we're going to enter a piece of data into the text box. And we've got three buttons here to save the data, display the data, and then remove the data from isolated storage. And then down at the bottom we have a little text area where it actually displays whatever we typed in up above after it's fetched it from isolated storage. So in this particular case, there's no additional namespaces we need to add. We've got isolated storage here. And we're not doing anything special in the constructor. In the button click, we're going to instantiate our isolated storage settings. So we're using the key value pairs. So we set that up, and then when they click it, we're going to look at whatever's typed into the text box, and we're going to see if there's user data as a key in our key value pairs. And if there's not, then you're going to create a new key called user data and stick whatever was in the text box in as the value. Otherwise, it's just going to update it. So you can see here in the code, if it doesn't exist, we're adding a new key value pair, and if it does exist, then we're just going to update the existing. And then we call save after that, which calls the save method on our application settings. The second button, this is where we're going to read in the data back from the isolated storage. And so we're just going to display user data and then whatever we typed in. So we look to see if the user data key that we created previously up here, user data, if that exists, then we're going to grab the data out of it, stick it in a string, and then append it to our text box. And then our third button here, of course, removes it. So it's going to check to see if there is a user data key in the app settings, and if there is, it's going to remove it, and if not, it's just not going to do anything. So if we go ahead and fire this one up. So right now there's nothing in isolated storage. And so I'm going to, you probably noticed that when I click there, the little soft input panel or the on-screen keyboard didn't pop up. There is a trick to doing that. Let me see if I can get it to pop up now. So when you're working in the emulator, it can be cumbersome to have to click on each individual letter with your mouse in order to type. And so if you hit the pause/break key on your regular computer keyboard, then that soft panel goes away and you can actually just type using your regular keyboard in the text box, which makes things a lot easier, especially when you're doing testing. So we'll say, we'll call this sample data, and we'll save our data. And what this does is this actually writes it out to isolated storage. And then when we hit display data, that's going to read isolated storage, and it's going to then display it in that text panel down below. And then, of course, removing the data takes it out of isolated storage, and if we hit display again, you'll see there's no longer anything in there. We do have one question that just popped up. It says, what were the shortcut keys for using the keyboard? That's the pause break key on your keyboard. And so if I hit that again, well, I'll have to click on the box first and then hit it. It'll, anytime you give focus to a user control that can accept input, that can accept text input, you automatically display the soft input panel anytime like a text box or something like that gets focused. But if you hit the pause break key, then you can make that go away and then just type it in as normal. All right, so let me go ahead and close out of that. And then it disappears whenever the control loses focus, which is convenient. So we've removed the data, and so even though it's sitting in our text box up here, it's not actually in isolated storage, which means if we hit display, nothing's showing up. And so that is how you do very simple isolated storage on the phone from an app settings perspective. Go ahead and close this one out. Get rid of that. And so next up we have networking. So networking on the phone, you have a couple of classes that you can use. You've got the web client class and the HTTP web request class. And what these do is these allow you to consume WCF services, traditional SOAP web services, REST services. So WCF services, for example, let's say you created a game and you've got a global high score service that keeps track of all the high scores for everybody that plays your game. And so your game can actually make a WCF call not only to post the most recent high score, but to perhaps pull back the top 10 and then display them within your app or game. REST services include stuff like Twitter uses a REST API, and so you're basically just you're passing in a URL with some query string parameters in order to do searching or in order to use the Twitter API to pull back your timeline or your friend feed. You also have the ability to do Azure. So there's a fairly recently released toolkit that you can get from Microsoft that allows you to take advantage of Azure services and storage. And then you can also use OData from your app in the phone. And so there's a number of really good references online that cover setting up an OData feed and then how to consume it from Windows Phone. So doing a full-blown demo on networking is a bit out of the scope for this webinar, but there are a number of really good resources on that as well, and I can post some links to good information in my blog if anybody wants to check that out after the webinar is done. So with that, that's pretty much the webinar. If you guys have questions, go ahead and start putting them in, and we can field some specific questions and revisit any material that you guys want to see more of, or I can post stuff out to my blog or whatever we need to do. It looks like we've got a couple questions here. How long is the data stored in the app? Is it for the lifetime? So that's actually a really good question. When you're working with the phone, then yes, it's for however long it stays there until you delete it. When you're dealing with the emulator, it's a little different. The emulator does not persist data from one run to the next. So the emulator does let you test and work with isolated storage, but if you shut off the emulator, it gets wiped out. And so every time you turn on the emulator for a new session, it's like you're turning on your phone for the first time ever. And so anything that you might have persisted in there between runs is gone once you close it down. Where do you get the data context SQL Server? Is this in 7.0 or 7.5? Well, there isn't a 7.5 yet. I know in 7.1 in Mango you can do it. I haven't tried it in 7.0. I can look into that and post an answer on my blog, which is www.bloggusmaximus.net. How would I get an XNA account from South Africa? That's a great question, and unfortunately I am completely unqualified to answer it. Your best bet would be to contact Microsoft on that. I know there are some countries that are part of that program, and then there's some that aren't, and I'm not really sure where South Africa falls, but if you go to the Create site, the create.msdn.com, then there are links there that will put you in touch with the right people to find out that sort of thing. But I do not know. Let's see. How do you set up a SQL database for use in isolated storage? That would probably take a little more time than I can cover today, but again, I can post some links to that in my blog and make some recommendations on there, or I could write up a blog entry that actually breaks it down step by step. Where can we download this PowerPoint and the source? So this presentation will be available from the DevExpress site. It usually takes about a day or so for it to go from a live presentation to a recorded presentation that you can view anytime. So I would check back tomorrow. And the source, I will post links in my blog to where you can get the source. You can get all of the demos from last week's webinar via my blog, which is, again, www.bloggusmaximus.net. And the most recent post covers all of the webinars we're doing, and then as they get posted to on demand, then I'm also putting the links for the demos. Let's see. How would I get an AppHub XNA account from South Africa? No one seems to know. Any resources you could furnish? I could have, tell you what, if you send me an email, which I'll go ahead and pop up the next slide here. If you send me an email on that, I can forward it to the community manager for XNA, and I can't guarantee that you'll get an answer from them, but at the very least, I can pass it on to them, and then hopefully they can get a hold of you. What's the next question here? I am running a Windows Phone 7 app from behind the firewall and use a proxy server to connect to the internet. When calling REST APIs from Silverlight, I am getting remote server not found error. Can we set the proxy server in Windows Phone emulator or Windows Phone application? Not to my knowledge. That isn't something I've run into or I've actually tried to do that, but I know you can't do it in the emulator. I don't think you can do it as part of your app, actually setting the proxy server. I think that would typically be dependent upon whatever network you're accessing. Could look into that further though. I'm not sure. The only difference between launchers and choosers is that the former don't return any values. Correct. So typically with a chooser, you're selecting something and returning it back to your application, where with a launcher, you're just firing off an external process, like sending an SMS text message or initiating a phone call. And so those won't return a value back to your app. You're just launching those. But choosers do return something back. Is it possible that we can get the live frames and images from the phone's camera? I'm not sure I understand the question, actually. You can pull, so are you asking if you can record video? I mean, you can certainly capture images from the phone's camera and then pass those back to your app. Is there any way we can read data from Bluetooth in the phone? Some Bluetooth device is sending strings, so is there a way to read that or write to some COM port? Not currently. At least not via XNA or Silverlight. Now, there may be some APIs that we as Joe developer do not necessarily have access to, but as far as just working within a Silverlight project or an XNA project, no. There's not any way currently to do that I know of. What type of binding Windows Phone uses for WCF services? Is it pure HTTP or HTTPS? You can use either with WCF. So if your service has a secure certificate, then you should be able to consume it securely. Can launchers be embedded so that user can get a feel of being in the app? Not at this time. So if you need to spin off an external process like generating an SMS text or a phone call, you're pretty much stuck with the dialogues they've provided you. And then, of course, you can return back to your app once you're done, but there's no way right now to skin those or make them look more like your app. Chris, you rock. Thank you. Let's see what else we got. Can I see this webinar in video? Yes, probably tomorrow at tv.devexpress.com. Can I access the camera flash using any launcher or chooser? Not to my knowledge. I don't believe that is currently possible to manipulate the flash programmatically. Can you leave an example of using the SQL isolated storage? I will definitely put something up in my blog probably within the next day or two. So just keep an eye out for that. I am talking about putting the browser media player in my app. Typically, if you're firing up a browser, again, it's going to be a separate process. There's not necessarily a way to embed it. So for example, in regular Windows development, you had the ability to have an IE control that you can embed within your form and then do some browsing as part of a larger experience. There's not a way at this time to do that within a Windows Phone app. And I think that might be the last question.
Yeah, I think you've actually gotten through all of those.
Oh, wait, here's another one. For the proxy question, he can use get default proxy in HTTP web request. Okay, well there you go. One of our listeners had the answer. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to either shoot me a message through my blog, which you can see on screen, or you can email me directly at christwilliams@gmail.com, and I'll try to get to all of them. The last couple of webinars generated a fair amount of email, which I was more than happy to respond to. Learned a few things myself along the way, actually. And so I'll typically post stuff like that up on the blog so everybody can see it. But I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Let's see. Yep. There's some more comments coming in, but they're all thank yous. So that's good. All right, so Chris's next webinar is next week. It's building a scrolling tile engine with XNA on Windows Phone. This webinar will show basic techniques for creating games that use a scrolling tiled map. Displaying sprites, 2D graphics is also covered. And that will be, let's see, when is that next? June 30th. So June 30th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time is Chris's next webinar. And we have a whole lineup of webinars posted for the months of June and July. Check them out and register at devexpress.com/webinars. Our final webinar this week is an Ask the XAF team with XAF evangelist Apostolos Bekiaris. This is a question and answer session with our Express App Frameworks team. So if you have questions for them, please join us and ask away. And next week, just a quick peek, Monday, June 27th, DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell on JavaScript using jQuery with DevExpress ASP.NET controls. jQuery is a great library for client-side DOM access and element manipulation. DXperience ASP.NET is a great library for producing rich internet applications. Join Julian as he delves into the intersection between them and shows how you can use jQuery to make your DevExpress ASP.NET applications even richer. And Tuesday, June 28th, introducing the ASP.NET Docking Suite. Again, if you missed anything from this webinar or you want to review any of our previous webinars or check out hundreds of online product tutorials, you can visit us on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com. And like Chris said, this usually takes about 24 hours, and you can watch and download this webinar usually by tomorrow morning. All right, again, thank you so much, Chris. Look forward to your next webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for choosing DevExpress.